Today we're going to be looking at every single niche poetry genre out there, both old and modern, traditional and, shall we say, strange. Welcome back to my channel, and if you are new, hi, my name is Danae Young, and I am a chronic poet. Thanks for your condolences. As a published author, I usually work in these sorts of areas of poetry, which, as we'll get into, are the more modern experimental spaces. That said, there are a lot of archaic poetry genres on this side of the map that are still used today, just usually with a modern twist. So I'll be showcasing classic examples as well as how modern poets have brought some of these traditional forms into the 21st century with them. I tried to keep this video relatively short, but this deep dive did take a while to make, so if you're excited, consider giving this video a like. I would really appreciate it. Now, to be fully transparent, there is a difference between poetry genre and poetry form, although there is some overlap. Genre has more to do with the poem's style and content, whereas form usually relates to more specific structural rules such as the number of lines, the rhyme, and the meter. And for the sake of this video and making sure you're not, on your deathbed by the time it's over, we're going to be delving into these genres mainly of poetry and skipping over the hundreds of poetic forms, because trust me, we would be here all day.
Hi, this is me editing, and listen, I just want to jump in and say I ordered a cute pointer stick for this video, but 2-day delivery failed me, and so you may notice that I'm using what appears to be an elongated paper towel tube. I had to improvise. Desperate times, you get it. Also, as some of you may know, this channel is super new. I've only filmed close-up videos until now, so I'm working on getting one of those small mics that you can hold and is better for farther away shots like this. That's why the audio is a bit echoey, but just imagine we're in one of those big seminar halls and you're listening to your favorite author on the stage right in front of you. So if you really think about it, the echo is actually more realistic. You're getting a premium immersive audio experience here. Not many other content creators out there are offering this. So actually, scratch everything I just said, and you're welcome. Okay, back to the video.
But who knows, maybe if this video gets enough likes, I will make that 3.5 hour video. Who's to say? So instead, we're just going to be including the genre of formal poetry, which is basically an umbrella term for everything that I was just saying. Poetry with a specified rhyme scheme and meter pattern, or a series of stressed and unstressed syllables. This is a genre for anyone who likes structure and rules. Think dress code, think your grandma's table manners, and trust that the genre will be policing your writing down to the number of syllables you use in each line. To list a few examples, this would include things like the haiku or the Petrarchan or Shakespearean sonnets. Full transparency, I honestly used to think of formal poetry as the straight-laced hall monitor type of character in the poetry universe, but over the years I have become more open to the idea that there can be a lot of creativity within restraints. On to narrative poetry. This subgenre includes any poems that have plot, characters, and setting. Shocker, I know. It's basically prose that's disguising itself as poetry. Okay, fine, that's definitely not a fair description. Given that early poetry way back, even before the Middle Ages, predominantly centered plot. The main thing that separated poetry from prose initially, besides its obvious indentations, had honestly nothing to do with narrative and everything to do with rhyme and meter. To largely oversimplify it, poems were essentially plays or stories that were rhythmic and rhymed oftentimes when read aloud. And that brings me to a subgenre of poetry you may have heard of, called epic poetry, which falls under the narrative umbrella. This is essentially a really long narrative poem that could fill up an entire book and centers a hero's journey. Trials and tribulations, adventure, potentially betrayal. An example of this is the not-so-little book called The Odyssey that you may have heard of by the one and only Mr. Homer, as well as John Milton's Paradise Lost as another example. And if you haven't read either of those, just imagine if The Princess Bride was just like one long poem following stressed, unstressed syllable structure.
You can die too, for all I care.
Oh. As you wish.
Oh, my sweet Wesley, what have I done? Ow!
Another type of narrative poem would be a ballad, which is definitely a much briefer take on the narrative poem, to say the least. It is a shorter narrative poem that is often accompanied by music. Now, there are some aspects of form associated with the ballad, which I know I said we're not going to talk about form, but just just let me cook for a moment. Because of their short, memorizable structure and the fact that they often are working that double shift as song lyrics, it makes sense that as a genre, they're also associated with oral tradition, passed down through people's voices rather than being written down. An example of an old-timey ballad would be Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe, the poem that Peter Kavinsky tried to convince Laura Jean was his own in To All the Boys I'd Loved Before.
The moon never beams without bringing me dreams of beautiful Laura Jean. And stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of beautiful Laura Jean.
And a more modern example of the ballad would be Taylor Swift's All Too Well. You know, before her lyricism went downhill.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that?
Moving on to a different section of the map, I have a question for you. I have a mouth, but never speak. I have a bed, but never sleep. What am I? Now, if you said river, you got me. What can I say? Guilty as charged. Poets.org defines a riddle as, quote, a short poetic form with roots in the oral tradition that poses a question or metaphor. Now, when you think of a riddle, you may think of something like this. Quote, a mystifying, misleading, or puzzling question posed as a problem to be solved or guessed, rather than something poetic in nature. But if you really think about it, the riddle is actually indicative of some of our earliest poetic devices, mainly the metaphor and the homonym. The riddle I just told you uses the wordplay of a river mouth and a river bed, which would both classify as homonyms. You may know this classic riddle where morning, afternoon, and night are used as metaphors for the beginning, middle, and end of someone's life. Some riddles can even be simplified down into a single metaphor. This old Persian riddle passed down orally reads as such, quote, a blue napkin full of pears, and the answer is a sky. And I guess if you see riddles and metaphors as like close sisters, it kind of makes sense why some people might say that poets talk in riddles. Although I would argue that our more modern interpretation of the word riddle implies that it's meant to actively confuse the listener, whereas metaphors used in poetry are meant to clarify an abstraction. I'm sure if you're a poetry skeptic, you might disagree with me on that, but I mean, you've gotten this far in the video, so we might be able to convert you. Now, much like riddle poetry, light verse is definitely on the goofier end of the spectrum when it comes to poetry. It's defined as poetry that's written primarily to entertain and amuse, with comedic, sometimes ridiculous themes. Like comedy in general, light verse can be more witty and calculated, or it can be intentionally nonsensical and stupid. Think a curated stand-up routine on one side of the spectrum, and whatever this is, or any other brain rot that's on TikTok right now, on the other side of the spectrum. Here are a couple of stanzas from Lewis Carroll's poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter, as an example of light verse. Quote, the walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. So yeah, overall, this duo here is the most unserious. So the chaotic, unhinged nature of a lot of light verse is arguably antithetical to the peaceful, serene atmosphere that pastoral poetry and a lot of poetry in this section of the map is trying to create. Pastoral poetry is defined by Poetry.org as, quote, creative works that idealize rural life and landscapes. And it was a full-on microtrend in ancient Greece, thanks to Theocritus, who actively idealized rural shepherd life in his poetry. Fun fact, the word pastoral comes from pastor, the Latin word for shepherd. And you know, we love an etymology that makes sense. We love to see it. Despite pastoral poetry hitting its peak centuries ago, we still see it today. This pastoral by Rebecca Lehman was published in 2021, and it describes the experience of a pregnant woman on this road trip. What she observes out the car window is, as you can see, where the natural imagery comes in. Alex Dimitritov's pastoral titled Central Park would be an example of a modern twist on the pastoral because he describes urban life as a contrast to the natural life in New York City. Now, the Aubade and Nocturne can technically fall under pastoral poetry depending on who you ask and how exactly they're written. Though I think they're technically more so thought of as a continuation or expansion on ancient Greek pastorals. Aubades and Nocturnes are nature-focused poems that specifically speak to the arrival of dawn or nightfall, respectively. The nocturnes are also associated with the solitude and reflection that comes with nightfall as well. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Ocean Vuong's Aubade with Burning City as an example of a modern aubade. In this poem, he describes how war distorts the appearance of dawn. Quote, "The song moving through the city like a widow, a white, I'm dreaming of a curtain of snow falling from her shoulders, snow crackling against the window, snow shredded with gunfire, red sky, snow on the tanks rolling over the city walls, a helicopter lifting the living just out of reach." Now, an example of a traditional nocturne would be C.S. Lewis's Irish Nocturne. Quote, "Now the gray mist comes creeping up from the waste ocean's weedy strand, and fills the valley as a cup, a filled of evil drink in wizard's hand." Now, moving down from night poetry, we see the subgenre of dark poetry, homonym very much intended. And for those of you who are like, dark poetry, isn't that just poetry with dark themes? I could have guessed that myself. I have no retort to that. Dark poetry is essentially an umbrella term for these more specific niches down here. Horror poetry seeks to directly scare or disgust the reader, whereas Gothic poetry cultivates an atmosphere of dread, sometimes using imagery that is culturally referential to death or horror. It's more for the vibes, for the aesthetics, and it doesn't necessarily have to have like a terrifying payoff in the end. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe is a classic example of a Gothic poem, and here are some other examples of Gothic and horror poems, respectively. Now, these can both fall under the category of speculative poetry as well, if they have imagery and scenes that are not within our reality. So we're talking fantasy, we're talking science fiction. You get the gist. So remember how we talked about ballads and how they're essentially stories with a musical accompaniment usually? Well, lyric poetry is that, but instead of having a narrative, it focuses on personal emotions and confessions. It's a brief therapy session that welcomes an accompanying melody. A famous lyric poem is "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud" by the one and only Mr. William Wordsworth. Classic. So within the lyric poetry category, we have odes, elegies, and panegyrics, which are essentially same words, different font, but we'll go over the differences anyway. An ode is addressed to a particular person or object, and therefore reveals the speaker's feelings or thoughts about this subject. You were likely forced to read Keats's Ode to a Grecian Urn in high school like the rest of us, but here's an example of a more modern ode titled Ode to M-, which expresses the author's appreciation for the pauses and silences in their life. An elegy is that, but specifically dedicated to someone who has died. It conveys grief and usually ends in a tone of consolation. Gabriel Ramirez's Abuelo, for example, is an elegy to their grandfather. Finally, we have the panegyric poem, which, similar to the ode, is addressed to a person or thing, only its main objective is, how do I say this, enthusiastic dick writing. Praise of the subject. Poet Ben Jonson wrote a panegyric to Shakespeare, and just listen to this. Quote, "I therefore will begin, soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage. My Shakespeare, rise, I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spencer, or bid Beaumont lie. A little further to make thee a room, thou art a monument without a tomb." Like, we get it, you love Shakespeare. I mean, I'm making fun of him a little bit, but let's be honest, if I were asked to write a poem about Ocean Vuong, it would probably end up sounding like that. Speaking of poems inspired by a subject, let's talk about after poems. And no, not the trash book and movie romance series, thank God.
Hey, Hon, good to see you. How you been?
Fucking Trevor!
People often use this term to refer to poems inspired by other poems, so it technically includes poems inspired by visual art pieces as well. You do want to be extra careful with after poems though, because if your piece isn't different enough from the original, we know what you're going to be charged with.
FBI, open up!
Now, following this is, of course, Ekphrastic Poetry, which is a poem inspired by a visual art piece specifically. Though Ekphrastic Poetry became prominent in the 1700s, I would argue that it hasn't really gone out of mainstream style as much as some of the other poetry genres we've touched on. There are entire modern poetry publications dedicated to this genre. I can't even say, oh, we're so back, because we were never gone to begin with. Ekphrasis has experienced a bit of an evolution, though. At first, it relied on detailed description as its main poetic device, basically using words to help the reader actually visualize the original piece of art. That kind of description has kind of been demoted to make way for artistic interpretation. So a poem that kind of dissects the meaning of an art piece rather than just visually describing what it looks like. Starry Night would be an example of an interpretive ekphrastic poem. What's cool about Ekphrasis is the collaboration it cultivates between artist and writer without them even having to be in the same room or the same century. But what if I told you that there's a whole genre of poetry reliant on people coming together to create a poem? Cue collaborative verse from stage right. I don't know why I said that, I'm not a theater kid. Approaches to this include a folding poem where a group of authors take an exquisite corpse type of approach. Each person adds 2 lines based on the previous line shown to them, folds the first line over so it's not visible to the next person, and passes it around until you have a full poem. There are a bunch of other writing games similar to that allow multiple authors to participate, and even entire community projects that are based around collaborative poetry. I decided to include translation poetry in this area, although it could technically go closer to after poems. Now, what I'm about to say may turn your world completely upside down, but translation poetry is when a poem is translated from its original language. Thank you. I am an expert, after all. There is a strong fascination with translated works in the poetry community, and I think mainly this is because it highlights differences in the ways languages and cultures approach things like description and metaphor. It's being able to capture the beauty and specific atmosphere of that poem through an entirely different structure of language, jumping from the idea of authors collaborating to the idea of genres collaborating. Prose poetry is both a form and a genre. What makes this qualify as a genre is the common writing style that tends to emerge in prose poetry. A lot of people think you just like remove the indents in a poem and like bibbidi bobbidi boo, you have a prose poem, but that's not exactly the case. This prose poem titled Strawberry Moon by Fran Choi reads, quote, "The house was filled with the smell of it. The last misshapen, sweet, heavy berries of the season losing their shapes on the stove. The house was filled with the smell of fruit unbecoming, fruit pulled to its knees at fire's feet. All summer long, the bushes had whispered, 'Take me,' shown us all the places we could kiss if we wanted. And so, as the light died, we put our mouths on the least lovable, the too full, the easy bruised. We shouted, 'I choose you, and you, and you, and you,' and canned that hunger and spooned it into our mouths on the coldest days." Like, that is not a microfiction paragraph. That is a poem, and you can't convince me otherwise. Now we are starting to get into some truly current experimental genres of poetry. Over here we have Docupoetry. Docupoetry, as I mentioned in my review of Minder Bang's collection, Yellow Rain, is poetry that takes archival materials, documents, newspapers, receipts, records, etc., and uses them to make poetry. Now let's look at some of the subcategories of docupoetry to see more specifically how these authors are using archived texts. Over here we have Erasure Poetry, also called blackout poetry. And this is essentially when an author takes a text and redacts or covers up a lot of the words so that the remaining text left creates a poem. Tom Phillips spearheaded this movement with authors like Austin Kleon following in his footsteps. Here you can see Reginald Wayne Betts creating erasure poetry out of court documents to transform unfair judicial rulings into his own political self-expression. Now, collage poetry is, as I mentioned in my experimental poetry video, the easygoing sister of blackout poetry. It allows authors to cut up the original text and actually rearrange its sentences, phrases, and individual words to create a new poem. These poems by writer and artist J.I. Kleinberg were created using various magazine spreads, so notice how she incorporates the blank spaces between columns of text in magazine layouts to create these meandering shapes across the page. The Cento is a more restrictive type of collage poem. It essentially allows you to take individual lines from different poems and rearrange them. Its name derives from the Latin word for patchwork. Essentially, just think of each line as its own quilt square made of different fabric. In this example, Wolf Cento uses lines from the works of 13 different prolific poets. This is another one that some people get major side-eye to, and if you're not careful, once again, the plagiarism committee will be knocking at your door. Now this bottom right section of our map here is what I like to call the deep end, because it's where you'll find some of the most batshit crazy experimental works out there. Catalog poetry, for example, is a poem in list form, and it can be responsible for some of the most extreme examples of modern paradoxis you'll probably encounter. In some catalog poems, words, images, or phrases are placed across the page without grammatical connection, and it's the reader's job to create connections and meaning between them. Some sections of Robert Castellewis's Voyage of the Sable Venus would fall within this genre, making that book pretty innovative for its time. Rebecca Lindenberg's catalog of ephemera is a more grammatically kosher take on the catalog poem. The beginning lines are the following sentences. Quote, "You give me flowers resembling Chinese lanterns. You give me hail for yellow. You give me vex. You give me lemons softened in brine, and you give me cuttlefish ink." Now, given how new visual poetry is as a genre, it makes sense that there's still a lot of debate surrounding its actual definition. But when in doubt, the Poetry Foundation's website has a pretty trustworthy glossary of poetic terms, so let's take a look at that. Oh! Quote, "A visual poem is one that must be seen to be fully understood, where the visual and verbal draw strength from each other to produce greater meaning. As such, visual poetry invites us to consider not just the typographic elements of verse, the shape of letters, the spaces between words, the overall composition of a page, but also the poetic potential of images." Graphic designer Ingrid Owen's book, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, titled A Wandering Poem, is an example of a visual poetry collection. The author refers to it as, quote, "a bilingual collection of emotional imprints." And as you can see, it plays around with how text can be used as a visual tool for art on the page. I can already feel the collective groan from some people at the validity of visual poetry as a subgenre. And to that, I only have one thing to say. Don't shoot the messenger. Our final stop on our poetry genre map is concrete poetry, also known as shape poetry. In my opinion, a more reserved, dare I say, classier kind of visual poetry. Not that it's never time for something as unhinged and bombastic as this, I just have to be in the right mood for it. But concrete poetry is any poem that arranges its text in a certain shape on the page. Sometimes these concrete poems allow for different pathways for reading a piece, such as this poem by E.V. Shockley. You don't know where to start, you don't know where to end, and that's kind of the point. In this fascinating poem that is simultaneously a concrete poem and an ekphrastic one, the author expresses her grief for a deceased sibling by making a poem inspired by one of her family portraits, but carved out this blank space here where her brother was originally standing in the photo. And while I'm overall a fan of experimentation in poetry, examples like this really do make other concrete poems seem pretty hollow in comparison. Like, did we really need this to be shaped like a swan? To put it frankly, I'm not convinced. That is going to be it for today's deep dive. In a second, you'll see a couple of options for other poetry-related videos that I think you might be interested in. And if you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like or joining this community. This channel is like 3 months old and recently hit 500 subscribers, and we are slowly but surely making our way to 1K. So if you want to be part of this little reader community that we are building, please don't be shy. The more the merrier. See y'all next time.